Welcome to When Women Preach. This podcast exists to empower AAPI and Latina women faith leaders. My name is Cris Otonari. We're also here with our CEO and co-founder of Isaac, Young Lee Hertig. Our guest for this episode is Daniel Lee. Daniel is a pastor of Bethel's English congregation. He grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and majored in English literature at Rutgers University. He continued his studies at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, as well as Harvard University in education. He got master's degrees at both of those. And then he also earned a Doctor of Ministry from Duke University. Daniel previously served as principal at Life Christian School. Together with his wife, Angie, Daniel envisions a community of not only Korean Americans, but people of all backgrounds serving others as Christ has served us, and working to usher in the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Daniel, welcome to When Women Preach. We're so excited to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. In my time kind of just speaking with you and Young, I'm not sure that you found the right person, or I feel like I'm out of place, but it's great to join you this morning.
Daniel, don't be too Asian.
Well,
You
Young
are
and I
here.
were.
You are
Yeah.
here because you are a rare breed of Asian American male ally. So we are really delighted to have you on board today.
Well,
Yep.
I'm so glad to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment. We were just talking about that before you logged on, how important and significant it is to have a male ally, and what a great way to end the year of When Women Preach. So also when I joined Isaac, I had imposter syndrome, and I thought, what am I doing here? And the reality is we belong here. You know, God has given us a voice and an opportunity. So I'm so glad you said yes.
Thank you for
Let's
having
jump
me.
on into some of the questions because I am excited that you are the first male guest I have hosted on this podcast. So let's dig into that, your experience with empowering women. So if you could, who are some women who have inspired or mentored you in your own faith journey?
You know, it's funny, like when y'all sent me the questions, I was thinking about it, and it was like kind of like this waterfall of constantly remembering people. And as I started to do that process, like more and more people came to mind, and it was just kind of overwhelming in a great way. And I think it just starts with my mom. My mom, my maternal grandmother as well. Really strong women, very Korean, but very different as well. My mom was a physician before she passed, and my grandmother was a pastor as well in Korea.
Wow.
And so,
Yeah.
in Korea, the term is 전도사, but she was a pastor at that time and just a real fierce woman. She taught herself English and Japanese because of, imperialism. She was fluent in Japanese. And so, those are the two women that come to mind right off the bat, and just kind of spending so much time with them growing up, and, seeing their lives and seeing how they lived out their faith, not always like in front of people, but sometimes more times behind the scenes than anything, was really meaningful to me. And so, I think it starts from there. I have a lot of aunts who also were very strong women, and showing me kind of that women could be more than just caregiver and mom, can be anything. And then, my sister, even though she's younger than me, she always just, by our closeness and our friendship, I think, she has influenced me so much growing up, of, how to be a good older brother, even though I haven't always been, and I always kind of feel like I could do better to her. She's always someone that I'm still close with to this day, and influences me, and the list really goes on. Like, I think of, I have a very close professor of mine from seminary. She's just a really, I can't curse on this podcast, can I? But a really awesome woman. And she, I guess just experiencing her in my early 20s, and just like spending time with her, even though it was a short time during seminary, like she really just showed me how, like, women can lead, women can do so much more than what society or the things that I had been uh, implicitly taught, or the things that have been communicated to me about women by just kind of like my observations or at church. Like, and so I feel like, it's just so many people that have really influenced me, inspired me, mentored me, and a lot of them probably didn't even know that they were doing that. And then of course, like I think about my wife, uh, my mother-in-law as well. Just there, and I think Young just laughed because traditionally, like mother-in-law, son-in-law dynamic is not really super close, but I think because I lost my mother in my early 20s, like I think
Mm.
I've always
Oh,
gravitated towards, like a mother figure. And my mother-in-law is like so different than my actual mom, but in so many ways, it's so comforting. And so when people who haven't met us see us interact for the first time, they often think that I'm actually her son, which is super cool.
mm.
But her love for me and sacrifice has always been such
Mm.
an inspiration to me. And so again, list goes on. My wife, she's the one that's courageous enough to put up with me. She inspires me and challenges me every day. And yeah, again, there's just so many people, and I'm just really grateful that I've had that in my life.
That's wonderful. And it's a great testament to you. You think about many of the people you mentioned are family, and just the closeness and tightness of your family. It's a
Mm,
great testament, I think, to you. And also the longstanding relationship with a professor that,
mm,
you
Hmm.
stay in contact after the class is over. That says a lot.
There's another
yeah.
person that you have a wonderful relational capital that's so rare. You are the first Korean American pastor who said, I'm in this church for almost 17 years because of my first immigrant congregation pastor, and how you and him work together so well. So that is really an unusual story, which should be more normative. If you can unpack that more, I think that is just such an amazing story, Daniel.
Yeah, I told Young this a month ago when we were just kind of talking, and uh, originally coming from the East Coast, it was never my plan to be in Oregon for very long. The story goes, the senior pastor at that time was a friend of my dad's from seminary. And so, my
Uh-huh.
dad being in full-time ministry, that's the other part of my story where
Mhm.
he had been an elder for a long time in church. And then when I was in middle school, he decided to go to seminary. And then one of his close
Mhm.
friends who I had known since middle school. He had taken the position as the pastor here at this church. And so he invited me to come out to Oregon to speak for the youth for a retreat they had. And as soon as I came out here, he was like, don't you want to
Mhm.
come to Oregon and do ministry? And I was like,
Sorry.
I was like, I was like, no, thank you. I don't know anybody. Back then, I still called it Oregon, and so I was like, I don't want to go to Oregon and do ministry. But uh, after the weekend, I got on the plane and it might have been over Minnesota or somewhere. Like I felt this deep sense of peace, and it was almost an
Mm.
audible voice saying, "You should do this." And there
Mm.
wasn't anything like there wasn't any clear instructions and picture of what it was going to be, but it was just you should go. And so I got off the plane, I called him, I contacted him, and I said, just give me a couple weeks to come out here um, and I moved out here thinking that I'd be there for about a year, at most two. However, that kind of morphed into my first stint was 4 years, and then I got so burnt out that I just had to move back.
Mm.
But then there was constantly this like relational connection, and then even though that pastor moved on, the new pastor who had come in 2010, 11 was so kind enough to invite me back to serve, even though I had left or it wasn't something on my radar for like a long-term plan. But as I mentioned to Young that day, he and I, the new senior pastor, we've been together for about 10 years. We're not that far apart in age, and he is definitely first generation Korean American, and yet he is so gentle, humble, a very atypical first
Mm.
generation Korean American at the same time. And so I'm grateful. He's very collaborative, very humble, even though he can, he's got credentials and everything out the wazoo, and he's so talented and capable. He treats me as an equal, and we really do have
Wow.
a great relationship. And again, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him. I know that for sure.
Let's find out his name. Let's name him.
Yeah, his name is Timothy Tonha Lee, and so
Mm.
he did his studies in Chicago. He's from Korea. He's the best. I can't
Oh,
say
wow.
enough. Yeah,
Wonderful.
Yeah, what a great story. Thank you for
yeah.
sharing that. Mm, awesome.
And I don't know if like that, this is kind of the background of it, but um, I think I personally have seen of so many men in the Korean American community, the Korean community. And again, because I'm Korean, I can kind of throw a little bit of shade and criticize, but I've seen
Mm-hmm.
so many not so great examples of leadership and ministry and selfishness and narcissism. Maybe, there has been so much trauma in the wake of male leadership
Mm,
being done in a certain way over
Yeah.
the years that we've all experienced. And yet, when I see like Reverend Timothy, it gives me hope. It's like a breath of fresh air. It was so different than anything that I had experienced in the past. And I think something about that just made me gravitate towards him. And, it made me feel comfortable about settling down. And so, like Young said, I've been here for, 17, 18 years, doing youth
Mm.
ministry. And then, the last 5 years has been doing the second generation, third generation English speaking congregation. And so, yeah, just again, really grateful. And it wasn't my plan. Like, I relate a lot with Jonah in the Bible, trying to run away and not not be where God wants me to be. That's me. But yeah, after a while, I just couldn't deny the calling. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah,
Oh, beautiful story.
yeah,
yeah.
you
Mm.
came back.
I
So
can't,
you're
I can't,
still
I
here.
came back, kicking and screaming. I came back. Yeah.
Mm.
Your story ends better than Jonah's story.
That's for
Thank you.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, since it sounds like you pretty much grew up with an egalitarian kind of philosophy in your family, because that's all you've known. Your grandmother was a pastor, but it, we know that that's not always the case in the Asian American church. So maybe
Hmm.
can you share a pivotal moment in your ministry where you witnessed either gender equity or the lack of it, and how
Yeah.
that impacted the church community?
Yeah. I think more than like an episode or an event, I think it's just kind of that, just piggybacking off that first question about the relationships that I had seen in my life or that I had in my life. Um, as I mentioned, my dad went into full-time ministry in middle school, and, as a leader, as a pastor, preaching and kind of always being in the forefront. But, and so I guess naturally growing up, I'm just like, okay, dad is more spiritual than mom. That's the assumption. But then,
Mm-hmm.
seeing my mom like in her quiet spaces, and like I said, she juggled so much. I mean, she was a physician, a pastor's wife, a mom, um, a sister, and to boot, she contracted lupus right after she had me, and so she had some severe health complications through our whole lives. And so, in the midst of all of these juggles, in 20 some odd years, she had 4 kidney transplants. And so
Oh,
just like seeing all of that, and then growing up, like seeing my mom in a certain way. Oh, she's the quiet pastor's wife. She's dad is leading her. And but then as I, you know, went through and got older and kind of, reflected on my experience with my mom and my sister, my family, my grandma, I realized like her faith was just as important, if not more, than my
Mm-hmm.
dad's, and formative to me. And and I felt like, unspoken values is that like women were kind of relegated to, being in the kitchen or teaching Sunday school or things that were not that valued in the church. It seemed like, and as I constantly kind of journeyed on, I realized that like that wasn't how I was raised. Even though my mom never like fought with my dad or argued with my dad saying, I'm more spiritual or this is the way things should be. Like just through her testimony in her life, it showed me just quiet strength. It showed me dedication and commitment to the Lord. It showed me like her uniqueness in being who she was and not being ashamed of that and leading from there.
Mhm.
And I think when I look at our church and when I look at even to this day, going back to that first question of like people who inspire me, a lot of women in our congregation, they inspire me by, faithfully following the Lord. And everybody's different. Like some of them are stay-at-home moms, some of them are working professionals, small business owners. And, I think to not lean into what God is doing in their lives and not to hear from them and not to give them opportunities to shape our congregation would be a huge miss. And so I think in terms of equity, in terms of giving people an opportunity, like, yeah, it goes back to the relationships that I've had in my life. I also am really grateful for being in Oregon. Like I said, even though it wasn't my original plan to be here, um, special shout out to like Portland Seminary. When we've been fortunate enough to have a lot of connections and relationships with the professors and the initiatives that are going on there. And a lot of them being women, a lot of them being people of color, really inspire us, right? And specifically, Nijay Gupta is somebody that was at Portland. I think he's at Northern now, but he wrote a book recently called Tell Her Story, and he's kind of
Mhm.
local in this area, and he's come and shared on a Sunday. But just the voices that we have in our lives, but then the scholarship that's coming out now that wasn't really highlighted when I was in seminary or 20, 30 years ago. um, I think is really spot on, and I'm just really grateful for that those voices and those influences are being more highlighted as they should be. Because as I read scripture and as I think about it, we wouldn't be here today without the leadership and the testimony and the strength of women all throughout the ages.
I mean, your story also parallels to Jesus' story. Who were the faithful followers to the
Hmm.
end? Who witnessed his death and resurrection?
Yeah.
Um, there's a connection there.
Mm.
Yeah, I really resonate with what you said about the academy and how it's different than when you went to seminary. And I only know the latter part because I'm in seminary right now. But I realize in talking to, especially white male leaders in the church, that the seminary experience they had was completely different than what I'm learning now. And
Hmm.
so for me, at Fuller, they're fully empowering of women and women of color, people of color, and uh, their old president came and spoke and said, it wasn't like this all the
Hmm.
time. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm having to figure out like how do I interact and engage with people who went to seminary a long time ago and haven't had the exposure that you have, like to Portland Seminary, so that
Yeah.
I'm not just like a squeaky wheel over here, like, hey, but what about women and what about these people of
Hmm.
color? So it's been an
Yeah.
interesting journey. I'm really grateful to hear how you're kind of bridging that. But
Y-
yeah, oh, so go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just gonna say it's not anything special, but I feel like just paying attention to the people that God has placed in our path or in our journey. And I think I've just been fortunate to, have some really great people and, really like uh, just just being grateful for them and their presence and listening to them and spending time with them. Like I think one of my strengths is just being very relational. And so because of that, I think I'm just forced to listen to their story and I'm not a great preacher, I'm not a great student or anything like that. Like I don't have an agenda to push. I'm not always like trying to plug a book or anything like that. And so I think because of that, I have to listen and hear where people are at, and so there's that kind of intentionality, and so I'm really glad to be able to do that, and I think a lot of it also comes from the fact that I have two little girls at home, and
Mm-hmm.
so when I think about like the kind of church that I want to raise them in, or the kind of community, or um, or the kind of place that I want them to grow up in, kind of world. I want them to grow up in a world where their voices are not muted, and they're taken seriously, and they're not, they don't have to take a backseat to anybody. And
Mm-hmm.
and so I think part of that also plays into the equation of why I think it's so important for, again, men to be allies, and men to um, really pay attention to what's happening, and what's been happening, and really being like unlearning the things that we should unlearn, and relearning the things that we should relearn in a healthy way.
I
So
echo with
good.
what you said, Daniel. The world we are turning into, 2025, our work for equity work and amplifying women's voice and women's lives even matter all the more. So we are deeply committed to amplifying, gender equality and equity work. So we could really partner with so many allies, because I say this bluntly, sexism is not women's problem, it's men's
Mm-hmm.
problem. So women doing this work alone will not cut. So that's why someone like you coming on our podcast and voicing these concerns is far more important than you might have realized.
Yeah, well, I'm grateful for that. And like I said, it's just because I've had so many great people in my life mentoring me. Um,
Hmm.
I think of like my friends also, a lot of them from grad school, seminary, education school. Like when I was in grad school, like many of us are, I was so green, and I didn't know anything. And I think they were patient enough to put up with me and deal with me. And as I just spent time with them, realizing, and they're all in different fields. They're in, school psychology, school counseling, the arts.
Hmm.
And just because of our friendship, and because of the things that they had experienced as women,
Hmm.
how there was this ceiling placed on them, and their fierceness, their fight, became my fight in a lot of ways,
Hmm.
and so I think, again, I owe it all to the relationships in my life, and definitely I'm just glad to do what I can.
Thank you. Hmm.
Daniel, I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on your current ministry context. You
Yeah.
mentioned that you are sensitive to the leaders, the women in your congregation, and they inspire you. Can you maybe talk a little bit about some of the opportunities that you might be able to give them? Like, what does that look like when they inspire you? What does that look like
Yeah.
for them?
Hmm.
Yeah, so I'm in just a traditional immigrant church, multi-generational. So our first generation church, it celebrates its 34th birthday in a couple weeks. And ever since then, here in the Portland, Oregon area, and ever since its inception and founding, there's been some form of a youth group or an English-speaking gathering, or whatnot. And so right now I'm pastoring the English-speaking congregation, and we're just so glad to have, and so fortunate to have, so many phenomenal women who serve and lead in many different ways. And again, a lot of it just goes back to who they are as individuals, whether they're single, whether they're married, whether they have kids, whether they're empty nesters, like different life stages. And
Hmm.
so, we have women doing a lot of different things, as, leading small groups, helping with, leading praise. Our praise team, our praise leader is a wonderful sister in Christ. One of our associate pastors is also is a woman as well. And for me, it really is like pushing and giving them opportunities to do things that they themselves probably feel a little bit uncomfortable doing. And what I mean by that is, I think traditionally being in an immigrant church, if I was in another context, it might not be this way, but being in a traditional conservative immigrant church context, uh, they grew up seeing, their moms or grandmas or seeing the women be a certain way at church, kind of like we mentioned about like being in the kitchen or like serving in that way. And even our first generation, even though we're all together, they might see some of the older first generation women being a certain way as well still. But
Mm-hmm.
for our context, I think part of my job, I want to push them more to like lead out in the front, to speak, to share. And for them, it is probably a little bit uncomfortable. It's probably something that they're not used to, because they have to kind of get used to that. Like for example, like our associate, I want her to preach as much as possible. She doesn't want to. And so that's something that like, I want to break certain weekends. So that's
Mm.
my selfish motivation sometimes. But also at the same time, I feel like it's so important to have her share her story and preach on Sundays from the pulpit, because, again, I want her voice to be just as important, if not more than mine.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of a little bit of a lot things going on, trying to do those things to give women a space to lead, and pushing them out of their comfort zones a little bit in our context.
Mm-hmm. Daniel, I think Pastoral Lab cohort is a
Hmm.
space where many women who are timid and unsure of their pastoral leadership and preaching,
Hmm.
literally, they say, I'm afraid
Hmm.
and I don't have confidence. After 2 years of journey and accompaniment, the power of seeing fellow Asian American women
Hmm.
lead pastor, Asian American woman church planters, they realize, oh my gosh, I can do this too.
Hmm.
So we have women getting ordained over the span of 2 years,
Hmm.
and then giving testimonial that, wow, I'm now confident, and I'm confident in my pastoral position, and I got ordained, and I'm leading. And
Hmm.
I know who I am as a leader.
Hmm.
So I think you pushing them and nudging them a little bit, those younger generation who see that exemplar out there at the pulpit, they too might be called by God and have that memory that I grew up with a woman pastor preaching at the pulpit. So that's how it all happens.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I 100% agree. And I've heard that from many other pastoras, that, like, oh, yeah, my boss was telling me to preach and I didn't think he was serious. Or,
Hmm.
like, I don't want to do that. And,
Yeah.
but over time, they come to believe that God has called them to that and that
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
they are capable. And so I say that to encourage you to continue gently pushing and exhorting
Hmm.
them into these roles of leadership. I hear you speaking into their potential and then kind of
Hmm.
calling them up into those roles of leadership, and it's totally wonderful. I just want to end on one
Yeah.
question, that if you could have a word of encouragement for Asian American and Latina women faith leaders who don't feel like they are in a context where they are supported in leadership, or yeah, just what's a word of encouragement for how they can take a next step?
Uh, I'll answer that by sharing the words of my professor, who, you know, we only spent about a year together, and she's this phenomenal lady. I don't want to name drop her, but she told me on like one of our first meetings together, classes, she said, anywhere you go, you have to assess like how long you're going to be there. And so she was saying like anywhere you go, you got to say, I got to, this place is somewhere I can be for a long time. This place is somewhere where, maybe I could kind of grit it out for a couple of years, or I got to leave now. And she tells this
Mm,
story where she was in this situation and she was so fed up that she like resigned on a paper napkin, on a dinner napkin, and she threw it at her superior. And so that's the kind of lady this my professor is and was. And so I think my word to Asian American and Latina pastors and leaders who are in context wherever they may be is just that, I guess, to really ask God, like, what is my time here, like, am I being supported, am I seen, are my gifts recognized, valued? And we all know too that, like, that's not just lip service, right? Is it really being followed through? Because we've all been in places where people say the right things to us and yet there's no follow through. But to really, like, consider that, and then to just follow through with that, as scary as it may be, to maybe if it's not the place and you need to resign on a dinner napkin too and throw it in your superior's face, like maybe that's what they need, because God's going to provide something. I firmly believe that. And so I guess my encouragement to them is, that they're seen, and they're valued, and they don't have to shrink or uh, be quiet, or do, or diminish their value or their personhood because of uh, a church context or another leader who is not seeing them properly. And to really be courageous, and to continue moving forward, because they've got so many people behind them supporting them, like Isaac, and like myself, and the people around them.
I'm gonna add one little announcement here. It looks like God is sending amazing leaders to Isaac 2025 through Thriving Congregation Initiative. And Daniel, you are one of the participants in 2025, and we have another Duke grad, PhD in physics, actually. And after PhD, he enrolled in MD program at Presbyterian Seminary in Virginia. So the caliber of the people who are approaching to Isaac and say, do you have men's program as well? Well, it's a co-ed program. And I think these two programs, Pastoral Lab for Women's program, Asian American Women, and then now TCI, it'll really embolden and amplify our effort to bring equity in the church. So I'm deeply grateful that you showed your interest in the program.
No, I'm thankful to you. Like I told Young when we talked a couple months ago, like I'm a huge fan of hers. I don't even remember like where our paths crossed, or how I was introduced to Isaac and to her work. But again, when I see you, Young, you're a little bit older than me, and so I see my my mom, like my aunties, like I see that, and so it's
Maybe
just very.
grandma.
Yeah, no, not that old. I'm old too, but I see that, and so I'm just grateful for your leadership and your strength and courage. Right, I'm sure you could share some amazing stories of how you had to just be who you are, and be courageous. And so I'm just grateful to you, and creating this space, and all this is possible through because of you, and your leadership. So I'm grateful.
Thank you. Make sure you add this.
Daniel, thank
Oh.
you so much for your time. My heart is full because it's so wonderful to talk to a male ally in this space. So thank you so much for being a guest, and we're really glad you were here.
Thank
We
you. I
have
appreciate you both.
My name is Joana. I am the sound producer for our podcast, When Women Preach. Thank you to all of our listeners who support us from wherever you are. We believe that the voices of Asian American and Latina women of faith are crucial to the building up of our faith communities and Isaac's mission to advance equity at the pulpit. So we invite you to continue supporting us by inviting your friends and family to listen to our podcast, or by making a donation to www.isaacsweb.org. Thank you in advance for making this work possible.